Long before humanity ever set foot upon its soil, Australia was a place of unimaginable change and wonder. The earth shifted, churned, and roared, molding a land unlike any other. Billions of years ago, immense forces beneath the surface waged silent battles, pushing molten rock to the surface and breaking apart vast supercontinents. Gondwana, a massive landmass shared with what are now Africa, South America, and Antarctica, slowly began to splinter. Over millennia, a fragment began its solitary drift, inching away into the vastness of the oceans. This ancient fragment, bathed in the isolation of its journey, became the Australia we know today. Its solitude would be its greatest gift. As the land drifted, it carried with it a wealth of life, plants, animals, and microscopic organisms that would evolve in splendid and peculiar ways, cut off from the rest of the world. The land itself was forged by extremes. The relentless heat of the sun baked its soils, while rivers carved deep valleys and gorges, their waters carrying stories of life and death. The air carried whispers of long-lost forests and seas, evidence of transformations that defied the passage of time. Every grain of sand, every rock formation, seemed to hold a memory of its violent, majestic origins. Australia's heart beats through its rocks. The ancient crust of this continent is some of the oldest in the world, over 4 billion years old. Within this crust lie secrets of Earth's infancy, a time when the world was still forming its identity. Massive volcanoes once dotted the landscape, their eruptions painting the skies with fiery light. These mountains, giants in their time, eventually wore away, leaving vast plains behind. Time, patient and unyielding, shaped a land that would resist and endure like no other. Life here was equally audacious. The flora began to rise from the ashes of volcanic soils. Eucalypts stretched their silver leaves skyward, defying the sun's burning glare. Banksias, wattles, and ancient ferns wove a green tapestry across the land, each uniquely designed to survive this unforgiving environment. In their resilience, they told stories of survival against all odds, adapting to droughts, fires, and poor soils that would have broken lesser species. The fauna of this land is a living testament to its extraordinary isolation. Kangaroos bounded across open plains, their tails strong and their leaps a symbol of a landscape in motion. Koalas clung to eucalyptus branches, their movements slow, deliberate, as though paying homage to the timelessness of their surroundings. Elsewhere, the platypus, a creature so strange it seemed to defy the rules of nature, slipped quietly into rivers, as though guarding the waters of this ancient land. But these weren't the only inhabitants. Beneath the earth, burrowing mammals like wombats carved out shelters, while in the skies above, cockatoos and lorikeets painted the heavens with flashes of white, red, and green. The songs of the lyrebird echoed through forests, imitating the calls of its neighbors and the sounds of the land itself. The story of Australia's wildlife is one of determination and ingenuity. It is a place where life learned to adapt in extraordinary ways, creating creatures that would not only survive but thrive. Some carried their young in pouches, ensuring safety in a dangerous world. Others developed defenses like venom or powerful tails, as though the land itself had gifted them its own raw, untamed spirit. Rainforests, once widespread, became sanctuaries for species that held on to the memory of a wetter, greener past. In contrast, vast deserts stretched endlessly, their ochre sands shimmering under the sun. These arid regions might seem desolate, but they pulse with life, hidden creatures waiting for the rare blessing of rain to bring them out of hiding. Australia's early climate shaped every part of this land. There were times of great floods when seas swallowed the coasts and pushed life further inland. Other times, droughts gripped the land with a harshness that seemed almost cruel, forcing both plants and animals to find new ways to endure. The rivers that now wind gently through the landscape were once torrents of unstoppable power, carving out canyons and nourishing ecosystems. The Murray and Darling rivers became lifelines, their waters carrying not just life but the essence of a continent that had learned to thrive on scarcity. The natural resources of Australia hold echoes of ancient abundance. Vast mineral wealth, gold, iron, opals, and more, lie beneath the ground, a reminder of the land's fiery beginnings. These resources shaped not just the land, but the destiny of its future inhabitants, luring dreamers and prospectors from far-off shores. Through it all, the land tells its story. Red cliffs bear the scars of relentless winds. Sunburnt plains stretch into horizons that seem endless. Each whisper of wind, each ripple in a waterhole, seems to carry an ancient memory. Australia is a land that feels alive, its spirit woven into every tree, every animal, every rock. The land was silent, ancient, and waiting. Over the horizon, the first people came, not as conquerors, but as a part of the earth itself. Their footsteps were soft, yet their presence would echo through time. Across vast seas and through endless challenges, they arrived, bringing with them the promise of life, connection, and stories that would root themselves into the very fabric of the land. This was over 65,000 years ago, a time so distant it feels almost unimaginable. But they were here, shaping a continent even as it shaped them. They moved with the rhythm of the land, reading its signs, understanding its whispers. The rivers, the stars, the shifting sands, these were their guides. To outsiders, it might seem impossible to survive in such a place, but they saw not hardship but abundance. The earth gave them food, water, and shelter. They, in turn, gave it respect, treating it as kin, as spirit, as life itself. In their hearts and minds, the Dreamtime stories took root. These were not just tales, but the very essence of their existence. Passed down from one generation to the next, they were songs of creation, maps of the land, lessons for life. The rainbow serpent slithered through the earth, carving rivers and valleys. Ancestral beings rose from the earth, shaping mountains and skies, leaving marks still visible today. These stories were alive, living in the rocks, the trees, the waters. Every cave painting, every ceremonial dance, was a reminder of a time when the world was new and full of promise. Their societies were not simple. Far from it. These were complex, interconnected groups, each with its own lands, languages, and sacred places. There were over 250 distinct languages spoken across this vast continent, each carrying its own songs, its own traditions. Knowledge flowed like a great river, shared through gatherings, marriages, and rituals. They understood their place in the world not as owners, but as caretakers. Their laws, called lore, guided them, ensuring balance between people and nature, between the past and the future. Their hands crafted tools that seemed to sing with purpose. Stone axes, sharp and sturdy, cut through wood to build shelters or carve sacred objects. Spears, hardened by fire, were tools of survival, used with skill and precision in the hunt. They wove baskets from reeds and grasses, each patterned a story, each not a memory. The boomerang, curved and graceful, was more than a weapon, it was a symbol of ingenuity, of understanding how air and motion could work together. Art was their voice, etched into rocks, painted on bark, woven into their very lives. Handprints, left behind on cave walls, seemed to reach through time, saying, "We were here. We are here." The ochre they used for their paintings came from the earth itself, its colors rich and vibrant, reds, yellows, whites. These artworks were not mere decorations, but windows into their beliefs, their connections to the land and its creatures. Their oral traditions were a web of knowledge, stronger than any written word. Elders, with voices as steady as the earth, passed on wisdom to the young. They told of where to find water in the driest seasons, how to track animals through the most challenging terrain, how to heal wounds with plants gifted by the land. These were not mere instructions, they were acts of love, of continuity, ensuring that life would endure. Ceremonies were the heartbeat of their lives. Fires crackled under the starlit sky as men and women painted their bodies with sacred designs. The rhythmic thud of clapsticks and the haunting hum of the didgeridoo filled the air, connecting the people to the spirits of the land. Every movement, every sound, was deliberate, carrying the weight of thousands of years of meaning. Through these ceremonies, they honored their ancestors, their traditions, and the land that had given them everything. Time moved differently for them. It was not linear but circular, like the seasons, like the cycles of life and death. Birth was not the beginning, nor was death the end. Everything was connected, intertwined in ways that words alone could not capture. The past lived in the present, and the present shaped the future. This understanding gave them a sense of purpose, a calm strength in the face of change. The land, harsh and unyielding to some, was a generous provider to them. They knew which plants could heal and which could harm. They knew when the rains would come and when the earth would dry and crack. They followed the migrations of animals, understanding their patterns as though they were old friends. Kangaroos, emus, and wallabies provided meat, while fish filled their nets and traps in rivers and seas. Their connection to the stars was just as profound. The constellations were not distant and unreachable, they were stories, guides, reminders of their ancestors. They watched the movements of the heavens, reading them like a book, understanding when to plant, when to gather, when to prepare for change. The Milky Way was a river of light, carrying the spirits of the departed, while the Southern Cross stood as a guardian over the land. As the years turned to centuries, then millennia, their bond with the land only grew stronger. They adapted to every change, every challenge. When the seas rose and cut Tasmania from the mainland, they adjusted. When the desert spread and the rainforests retreated, they found new ways to live. Their resilience was their strength, their knowledge their shield. This was a world filled with meaning, a tapestry woven from the threads of land, sky, and spirit. Every step they took, every word they spoke, was a testament to their understanding of this place. They were not just inhabitants, they were a part of Australia, as much as the red earth, the vast skies, and the endless horizons. Their story is not just one of survival but one of thriving, of flourishing in harmony with a land that became their eternal home. The waters shimmered with an almost ethereal glow, the gentle waves whispering secrets to the winds. Between the northern tip of Australia and Papua New Guinea lay the Torres Strait, a mosaic of islands and reefs where life thrived against the pulse of the sea. It was here, long ago, that a resilient and proud people made their home. The Torres Strait Islanders, their roots as ancient as the tides, carried stories that flowed like the currents surrounding them. They were born of the sea. Every breath, every heartbeat seemed tied to the waters that gave them life and purpose. Their origins were intertwined with the land, the stars, and the oceans that stretched endlessly before them. Long canoes carved from the strongest trees cut through the waves, gliding with purpose and grace. The people within were not merely travelers, they were navigators, guided by the rhythm of the sea, the flight of birds, and the whispers of the winds. Generations of knowledge sat in their minds and hearts. They knew the way the stars danced in the night sky, and they followed those lights like old friends. The trade winds, steady and reliable, carried them across the strait, connecting island to island, land to land. Their hands wove nets and lines, crafted sails, and carved tools that seemed almost to hum with purpose. These tools were extensions of themselves, blending skill with the deep respect they held for their environment. Trade was their lifeblood. Long before the concept of borders existed, they built bridges of connection with neighboring peoples. From Papua New Guinea came sago, pottery, and ceremonial masks, carried across the sea like treasures. In return, they gave shells, pearl ornaments, and their art, vivid and alive, painted with ochre and imbued with stories. Their canoes, loaded with goods and hope, crossed vast stretches of water, turning the sea into a bustling highway of culture and commerce. Yet trade was more than just the exchange of items. It was the exchange of spirit. A meeting of people was a meeting of worlds, where songs were shared, dances performed, and languages spoken like melodies that wove cultures together. The Torres Strait Islanders knew that connection went beyond things. It was about understanding, about weaving threads of humanity across the waves. The islands themselves were sacred, cradles of life surrounded by azure waters. Mangroves hugged the coasts, their roots digging deep into the sands to hold the land steady against the tide. Coral reefs bloomed beneath the surface, their vibrant colors mirrored in the islanders' ceremonial attire. The islands bore witness to feasts and laughter, to dances that imitated the flight of birds and the leap of fish. The islanders' art was a symphony of color and movement, painted with precision and care. Masks crafted from turtle shells told stories of creation and survival, their intricate designs reflecting the mysteries of the sea and sky. Their songs carried the weight of generations, their rhythms echoing the pounding of waves against the shore. Drums, carved with devotion, beat out the pulse of life, uniting communities in moments of joy and remembrance. Theirs was a culture of resilience. The sea was a bountiful provider, but also a formidable force. Storms would rise without warning, the wind howling like a beast unleashed. Waves crashed against their canoes and shorelines, but they stood strong, their spirits unbroken. They read the sky, the winds, and the waters, preparing for what would come. It was a life that demanded respect for nature's power, and they gave it willingly. Their connection to the land was as profound as their bond with the sea. Each island held its own stories, its own spirits. The rocks, the trees, the sands, they were all alive with memory. Ceremonial grounds became places where the living and the ancestral met. Songs and dances honored the past, ensuring the wisdom of the old ones would never be lost. The islanders believed in their duty to maintain balance, to care for the land and sea as they would a family member. The Torres Strait was a tapestry of life and movement, a meeting place where cultures blended seamlessly. The islanders were not isolated but interconnected, drawing strength from their bonds with the people of Papua New Guinea and beyond. The boundary between land and sea blurred in their world, creating a life filled with richness and purpose. Each sunrise brought new possibilities. The light danced on the waters as fishermen cast their nets with practiced hands, their faces glowing with the promise of the day. Children played in the shallows, their laughter mingling with the cries of seabirds. Elders sat beneath the shade of trees, their voices steady as they passed on stories of old, the young listening with wide-eyed reverence. The Torres Strait Islanders lived as one with their world. Their traditions, their knowledge, their love for their home, it was all woven into a powerful tapestry of resilience and beauty. Every wave that lapped the shore, every star that shone above, seemed to celebrate their enduring spirit, a people shaped by the sea and sky but rooted deeply in the land they called home. The salty breeze carried a strange rhythm, faint yet mesmerizing. It was the sound of sails billowing against the wind, of men speaking in tongues unfamiliar, their voices mingling with the calls of seabirds circling overhead. From the vast horizon came the Macassan traders, their wooden prows cutting through the waves with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. They were seafarers, travelers who had ventured thousands of kilometers across treacherous seas, drawn by the promise of connection and the treasures of the northern shores of Australia. On the beaches of Arnhem Land, the local Yolngu people watched as the Macassan vessels approached. Their sails were tan with the wear of countless voyages, their hulls painted with the marks of distant lands. The Macassan stepped ashore, their feet sinking slightly into the golden sand, and for a moment, there was silence. Eyes met, curious yet cautious, the weight of this first contact hanging heavy in the air. Slowly, gestures replaced words, and a shared understanding began to take shape. The Macassans had come for trepang, sea cucumbers that thrived in the warm, shallow waters. These creatures, strange and unassuming, were a delicacy in markets far away, valued for their taste and supposed healing properties. The Macassans brought tools, knives crafted with precision, to harvest the creatures, and they built smokehouses along the shoreline to process them. Fires burned day and night, their smoke curling into the sky, carrying with it the aroma of labor and enterprise. But this interaction was not merely transactional. The Yolngu and the Macassans found ways to share their worlds. The Yolngu, with their profound connection to the land and sea, shared their knowledge of the tides, the best places to fish, and the seasons when the waters teemed with life. The Macassans, in turn, shared their tools, their language, their customs. The Yolngu learned to use iron knives, far sharper and more enduring than the stone tools they had relied on before. They began to incorporate Macassan words into their language, evidence of a bond that grew stronger with each passing season. Trade became more than an exchange of goods, it became a dance of mutual respect. The Yolngu offered pearls and turtle shells, the Macassans brought cloth, tobacco, and rice. Over time, the rhythm of these visits became woven into the lives of the coastal communities. Children played along the shores, imitating the gestures of the moccasins as they worked. Elders watched with cautious approval, knowing that these interactions carried both opportunity and risk. There were whispers, too, of other contacts, of other seafarers who may have reached these shores. Theories of Chinese sailors venturing south, guided by the stars and the promise of new lands, lingered in the imagination. The Chinese, masters of navigation and trade, had records that spoke of lands beyond the familiar, places where the earth yielded treasures and the people carried wisdom. It is said they brought silks and ceramics, their goods delicate and refined, their intentions less clear. And then there were the Portuguese, the bold explorers whose maps hinted at a knowledge of Australia long before the Dutch or the British. Their ships, sturdy and daring, had ventured further than most, guided by the insatiable desire to chart the unknown. Some believe they may have reached the northern shores, their presence fleeting but impactful, leaving traces in whispered stories and unconfirmed artifacts. Each theory, each tale of contact, adds a layer to the fabric of history. The shores of Australia, timeless and patient, bore witness to these encounters, each one leaving a subtle mark. These external contacts were more than chance meetings, they were moments where different worlds brushed against one another, leaving ripples that would echo through time. The Yolngu people, with their deep-rooted traditions and unshakable connection to their land, absorbed what was useful, adapting without losing themselves. The Moccasin traders, skilled and adaptable, brought not only goods but a respect for the people they met. Together, they created something unique, a relationship built on understanding, on the unspoken knowledge that despite their differences, they shared the same winds, the same stars, the same oceans. Even as the Moccasins sailed away, their prows disappearing into the horizon, their presence lingered. The Yolngu knew they would return, just as the tides always did, bringing with them stories of distant lands and the promise of connection. And as the sands of time shifted, these interactions became part of the story of Australia, a story written not in books but in the hearts of the people and the land itself. The waves seemed endless, a rolling expanse of blue that merged with the sky on the farthest horizon. The sailors stood at the bow of their ships, eyes scanning the unknown, hearts heavy with equal parts trepidation and hope. They were venturing into lands marked only by whispers and speculation, driven by a desire to map the unmapped, to find what lay beyond the edge of familiarity. These voyages, precarious and perilous, would leave their marks not only on the charts they carried but on the histories of the places they touched. The year was 1616 when Dirk Hartog, a Dutch mariner aboard the Eendracht, found himself staring at the jagged coastline of a land unlike any he had known. The barren cliffs of what would later be known as Western Australia rose starkly against the vastness of the Indian Ocean. Stepping ashore, he left behind a pewter plate etched with words that spoke of his fleeting presence, a token to those who might follow. Hartog could not have known then that his name would echo through the ages, forever linked to this enigmatic land. The Dutch ships were sturdy and built for endurance, their sails straining against the winds that carried them toward uncharted territories. Abel Tasman, another Dutch explorer, ventured further, his expeditions weaving through the waters that surrounded this vast continent. In 1642, his eyes fell upon the island we now call Tasmania, a land of dense forests and towering mountains cloaked in mist. He charted the northern shores of the landmass, naming it New Holland, yet the interior remained a mystery, its secrets guarded by distance and time. The Dutch left their mark on the coastlines, names like Cape Leeuwin and Arnhem Land whispered of their voyages. But their focus was elsewhere. The riches of the East Indies, with their spices and silks, beckoned more urgently than the desolate expanses of Australia. The land, vast and ancient, waited silently, its story yet to intertwine with those who sought to claim it. Over a century later, in 1770, a new figure emerged on these distant shores. James Cook, commanding the British ship Endeavour, sailed along the eastern coastline, his eyes alight with determination. Unlike the Dutch before him, Cook saw not only the land but the potential it held. He noted the rich soil, the abundance of flora and fauna, and the intricate patterns of smoke rising in the distance, signs of life, of people who had called this place home for tens of thousands of years. When the Endeavour anchored near the shores of what is now Botany Bay, the air was thick with anticipation. The sight of towering eucalyptus trees, their leaves shimmering silver in the sunlight, painted a picture of a land both wild and ancient. Cook and his crew stepped onto the sandy beach, leaving footprints on a land older than memory itself. They marveled at the strange creatures that bounded through the scrub, at the vibrant birds that filled the air with their cries. Cook's journals recorded his observations, his thoughts racing ahead to what this discovery might mean. He claimed the eastern coast for Britain, naming it New South Wales, a decision made without understanding the depth of connection the land held for those who already lived there. The arrival of the Endeavour was a moment of profound consequence, one that would ripple through the lives of the Aboriginal people and reshape the history of the continent. Yet even as Cook charted the coastline, there was a sense of awe, of something larger than himself. The Great Barrier Reef loomed beneath the waters, its beauty matched only by its danger. The Endeavour struck the reef, its hull scraping against the coral as the crew worked frantically to save their ship. For weeks, they labored, patching and repairing, their survival balanced on a knife's edge. Cook pressed on, his maps becoming more detailed with each passing day. His mission was not merely exploration but documentation, to sketch the contours of this vast land and bring its existence into the consciousness of Europe. The coastline stretched endlessly before him, its cliffs and beaches hinting at the vastness that lay beyond. For the British, Cook's voyage was a moment of triumph, a claim to lands they believed would expand their empire. For the Aboriginal peoples, it was the beginning of an irreversible change, one that would bring upheaval and loss. The sands of Botany Bay, the waters of the Pacific, the towering cliffs of the eastern coastline, all bore silent witness to the meeting of two worlds, each as foreign to the other as the stars are to the sea. The age of exploration was a time of daring and ambition, of men who braved unthinkable odds to find what lay beyond. The land they reached, Australia, stood timeless and unyielding, a canvas upon which these stories were etched. And while the explorers would return to their homelands with tales of their discoveries, the land remained, ancient and eternal, holding within it stories far older than any they could comprehend. The waves lapped against the hulls of the ships, their steady rhythm a haunting counterpoint to the silence on board. The convicts, chained and crammed into the dark holds, clung to scraps of hope or bitterness. They were human shadows, torn from their lives in England, Scotland, and Ireland, branded criminals for theft, dissent, or simply being too poor to avoid the law. Above them, the officers and Marines stood beneath a sky blazing with stars, wondering what awaited them at the edge of the known world. After months at sea, in January 1788, the fleet of 11 ships, the First Fleet, arrived at the mouth of Port Jackson. The air was heavy with salt and heat, and the shoreline stretched before them like a mystery, its forested cliffs silent and unwelcoming. For many on board, the sight of the land should have brought relief, but it only deepened the ache of uncertainty. This was no England, no place of cobbled streets and familiar smells. This was raw, untouched land, its secrets held close. The ships anchored, and the convicts were brought ashore. They stumbled on the sandy beach, their legs unsteady after months confined at sea. Their eyes met an unfamiliar world, trees with twisted trunks, creatures that seemed to leap instead of walk, and a sky that seemed endless. The officers barked orders, urging the weary and frightened men and women to begin unloading supplies. Timber was cut, and tents were pitched, the beginnings of a settlement emerging from the wilderness. They named it Sydney Cove, in honor of Lord Sydney, a gesture of loyalty to the crown that had sent them to the other side of the earth. But survival was an uphill battle. The soil was dry and unyielding, and the crops they planted refused to grow. The food stores dwindled, each ration a reminder of the precariousness of their lives. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, and sickness swept through the camp, claiming lives indiscriminately. The officers, too, felt the strain, their polished boots and crisp uniforms offering little protection against the relentless sun and biting insects. For the Aboriginal peoples, the Eora Nation, this strange invasion was an affront to their land and lives. They watched from the shadows of the trees, their hearts heavy with confusion and anger. These newcomers brought with them foreign weapons, animals, and diseases that began to tear through their communities like an invisible fire. Where once they had roamed freely, fishing in the harbor and gathering bush foods, now they found fences and muskets blocking their way. Encounters between the settlers and the Eora were tense and often hostile. The settlers, desperate to survive, took what they needed: firewood, water, and hunting grounds, without thought to those who had lived here for countless generations. The Eora resisted, their spears and boomerangs no match for the settlers' muskets, but wielded with fierce determination. In one rare moment of fragile peace, a man named Bennelong, a leader among the Eora, was captured by Governor Arthur Phillip in a bid to foster communication between the two groups. Bennelong, resilient and curious, learned the settlers' language and customs, becoming a bridge between worlds. Yet even he could not undo the deep scars that had already formed. His story was one of compromise and survival, but it was also one of loss, a reminder of what the arrival of the First Fleet truly meant for his people. Back at the settlement, the struggle to adapt continued. Convicts were put to work felling trees, building shelters, and carving out a semblance of order in the chaos. Women, few in number and often victims of the men's desperation, bore the additional burden of survival, their resilience tested daily. As they built their crude homes from the earth and timber around them, they began to dream of something more, if not for themselves, then for the children they carried. For those in authority, like Governor Phillip, the task was enormous. He saw the colony as more than just a penal outpost. It was a test of resilience, a seed of civilization to be planted in the wilderness. Yet even Phillip struggled against the unrelenting challenges: hostile land, uneasy relations with the Aboriginal peoples, and the fragile psyche of a population torn from their homelands. Slowly, painfully, the settlement began to take root. The first crops finally sprouted, timid green shoots against the backdrop of red earth. Livestock multiplied, and the convict laborers, some skilled tradesmen in their previous lives, began to shape the settlement with their hands and their sweat. For many, it was a bitter irony, the freedom of this vast land juxtaposed with the chains that bound them. And yet, even in chains, some convicts found redemption. The harshness of the land forged resilience, and the camaraderie among the laborers softened the bitterness of their existence. Together, they faced the brutal summers and the bone-chilling winters, finding in each other a strength they had not known they possessed. The land, so alien at first, began to reveal its patterns. The settlers learned from the Aboriginal people, sometimes through stolen knowledge, sometimes through fragile alliances. They learned to read the skies and the seasons, to listen to the land instead of fighting it. The kangaroos and emus that once seemed strange became a source of food and wonder. The gum trees, with their peeling bark and fragrant leaves, became shelter and fuel. For the Aboriginal peoples, however, the cost of this settlement was unbearable. Their land was no longer theirs alone, their way of life disrupted beyond recognition. Yet even in the face of such loss, they endured. They sang their songs and told their stories, their voices rising above the sound of axes and hammers, a defiant reminder that they were still here. As the sun set over Sydney Cove, the light bathed the settlement in hues of gold and crimson. Convicts rested on the rough-hewn benches they had built, their calloused hands cradling tin cups of weak tea. Officers stood by the shoreline, their gazes fixed on the horizon, as if longing for home. And in the distance, the smoke of Aboriginal fires curled into the sky, a reminder of lives that had been lived here long before the first sails appeared on the horizon. The land stretched wide and open, its silence broken only by the rustling of wind through dry grass. It was an ancient silence, carrying the echoes of footsteps that had walked these lands for thousands of years. The soil, rich and red, bore witness to countless stories of life, survival, and the deep connection between the people and the earth. But this silence was about to change, forever. When settlers pushed beyond the fragile boundaries of Sydney Cove, they saw the land as empty, untamed, and waiting to be claimed. They carved fences across plains and valleys, cut down trees that had stood for centuries, and turned sacred sites into fields for crops. To the settlers, this was opportunity, a promise of prosperity. To the Aboriginal peoples, it was devastation. The rivers that had given life to communities for millennia were blocked and diverted. The hunting grounds where kangaroos once roamed freely were now claimed by cattle and sheep. The scars left by axes and plows cut deep into the hearts of those who had lived in harmony with this land. What the settlers called progress felt like erasure to those who had always been here. But the Aboriginal peoples did not remain silent. They stood in defiance, their resistance fierce and unyielding. Leaders like Pemulwuy, a warrior of the Bidjigal people, rose to challenge the settlers. He led his people with bravery and determination, fighting to protect their land and way of life. Armed with spears, he faced muskets and soldiers, knowing the odds but refusing to surrender. His spirit became a symbol of resilience, even as the land he fought for was taken piece by piece. Elsewhere, other communities fought back in their own ways. Fires lit in the night destroyed settler crops. Stockyards were raided, cattle driven away into the wilderness. These acts were more than retaliation, they were statements of survival, a refusal to be erased from their own history. But the settlers were relentless. They brought with them policies of dispossession, enshrining their claims to the land with laws that ignored the rights of its first inhabitants. Governor after governor declared vast tracts of land as belonging to the crown, erasing the spiritual and cultural significance of these places with the stroke of a pen. What was sacred became property. What was home became territory. And with these policies came massacres. On cold mornings and dark nights, men on horseback rode into camps, their rifles aimed at those who stood in their way. Entire communities were wiped out, their voices silenced forever. At Myall Creek, the horror unfolded as Aboriginal families were chained and slaughtered by settlers who saw them as nothing more than obstacles. The grief that followed was unmeasurable, a heavy shadow that lingered over the land and its people. The stories of these massacres are hard to tell, but harder still to forget. Mothers shielding their children from gunfire, elders calling out warnings that came too late, and the cries that echoed in the valleys where peace once reigned. These were not just losses of life, they were losses of language, culture, and memory. The land itself seemed to mourn, its rivers running red and its skies heavy with smoke. And yet, amidst the darkness, there were moments of resistance that burned brightly. Tribes forged alliances to fight back, their unity a powerful force against the settlers who sought to divide them. They passed down knowledge, teaching the young how to navigate the land and protect their people. Songs of defiance were sung around campfires, their melodies carrying both sorrow and hope. Even as the settlers' fences stretched further, the Aboriginal peoples held fast to their connection with the land. They told stories of their ancestors, their voices filled with pride and determination. These stories were not just memories, they were acts of defiance, reminders that no amount of violence or dispossession could sever their bond with the earth. The settlers, too, began to fear what they could not understand. They saw the land as something to conquer, not something to respect. But the land had its own voice, one that could not be silenced. Floods swept through their farms, fires consumed their homes, and the very earth they tried to claim pushed back against their efforts. For the Aboriginal peoples, these events were not punishments, they were warnings. They knew the land was alive, its spirit as enduring as their own. And so, even as they faced unimaginable losses, they refused to let their stories be forgotten. They passed them on in whispers and songs, in the footsteps of children learning to walk, and in the quiet moments when the land seemed to breathe alongside them. The settlers called it progress, but the Aboriginal peoples knew it by a different name, invasion. It was a battle not just for land, but for survival. Every tree cut down, every river blocked, every life taken was a wound that would never fully heal. But the strength of their ancestors lived on in them, a flame that could not be extinguished. The land, scarred but resilient, carried the weight of it all. Its vast horizons held the memories of those who fought, loved, and lived here long before the settlers arrived. It bore witness to both the violence and the resilience, the loss and the hope. And as the sun set over the plains, its light painted the land in shades of gold and crimson, a silent tribute to the enduring spirit of its first peoples. The sun rose over rolling hills, its golden light spilling across a land that seemed to hum with quiet anticipation. The air carried the scent of dew-soaked grass and the faint, earthy aroma of freshly turned soil. It was a morning like so many others, yet it felt different, charged with the energy of something new. Change was taking root, like the first shoots of a plant breaking through the earth. The chains had begun to fall away. For decades, the sound of iron shackles clinking in rhythm with the footsteps of those who bore them had been a part of the land's heartbeat. But now, a different rhythm was emerging. In some regions, the transportation of convicts had ended. The brutal days of forced labor and penal punishment were fading, replaced by whispers of freedom and new beginnings. People no longer arrived in chains, they came with dreams, hopes, and a fierce determination to make something of themselves. The land offered its own kind of promise, vast and untamed. Fields of wheat stretched toward the horizon, golden and endless under the Australian sun. Sheep dotted the hillsides like scattered clouds, their fleece the lifeblood of a growing industry. The wool trade surged forward, the soft strands that came from these gentle animals finding their way to markets and mills across the seas. Each bale was a story, woven with sweat, struggle, and the belief that this land could provide not only survival but prosperity. But the land was not easily tamed. The earth was stubborn, often parched and unyielding, as if testing the resolve of those who dared to claim it. Farmers bent their backs under the scorching sun, their hands blistered from the tools that tore through the soil. Droughts came like unwelcome visitors, stealing crops and hope in equal measure. Yet, the settlers endured. With each furrow plowed and each seed planted, they left a mark, not just on the land, but on themselves. Amidst the toil, the echoes of old struggles lingered. Aboriginal peoples watched these changes with wary eyes, their lands taken and their lives disrupted. Their connection to the earth, ancient and profound, clashed with the newcomers' relentless drive to divide and conquer. Each fence built, each boundary drawn was a reminder of what had been lost. And yet, the land itself seemed to carry their grief, holding their stories in its rocks and rivers. The settlers forged new communities, their towns emerging like oases in the wilderness. Churches with simple spires reached skyward, schools opened their doors to eager children, and markets buzzed with life. These settlements were more than just places, they were the seeds of a society taking shape. Men and women gathered at town meetings, their voices rising in spirited debate over the future they were building together. Governance took its first shaky steps, laws drafted and enforced in the name of order and progress. The settlers demanded a say in their own affairs, their voices insistent and determined. They were no longer content to be ruled by distant powers, they wanted their own leaders, their own systems, and their own vision for what this land could become. These were the first sparks of a new identity, one rooted in resilience and a fierce sense of independence. Amid the struggle for stability and growth, moments of joy bloomed like wildflowers. Families gathered for harvest celebrations, their laughter ringing out under starlit skies. Children played in open fields, their shouts of delight mingling with the songs of birds. Neighbors shared meals, their tables piled high with the fruits of their labor. These were the moments that made the hardship bearable, that reminded them why they had chosen to make this place their home. And through it all, the wool industry grew, its influence spreading like ripples across a pond. Shearers worked with practiced precision, their hands guiding blades through thick fleece. The air filled with the sound of clippers and the bleating of sheep, a symphony of labor that spoke of both exhaustion and achievement. Each roll of wool was a testament to perseverance, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there was a way forward. Yet, the land was not without its challenges. Fires swept through dry brush, consuming everything in their path. Torrential rains turned dirt roads into rivers of mud, cutting off towns and isolating families. Disease crept into flocks, threatening the fragile livelihoods of those who depended on them. But even in the face of such trials, the settlers refused to yield. They rebuilt what was lost, replanted what was destroyed, and carried on with a determination that seemed as endless as the land itself. In these years, the settlers began to see themselves as more than just survivors, they were builders, creators, pioneers. They crafted lives not only for themselves but for future generations, laying the foundation for a society that would one day flourish. They carved their stories into the fabric of the land, their struggles and triumphs woven into its hills, valleys, and plains. The land, vast and unyielding, bore witness to it all. It absorbed their sweat, their tears, and their laughter, becoming a silent partner in their endeavors. And as the sun set over the fields, casting the world in hues of amber and crimson, it seemed to reflect the spirit of those who had worked so hard to call this place home. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, filled with both uncertainty and the promise of what could be. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that crackled and sparked like a storm on the horizon. A rumor, passed from one hopeful soul to another, whispered of unimaginable riches buried beneath the earth. It wasn't just gold they spoke of, it was freedom, opportunity, and the chance to rewrite one's destiny. The year was 1851, and a fever was spreading, not one of sickness, but of hope and desperation. In the cool light of dawn, men and women with little more than a pickaxe and a dream began their relentless march toward the goldfields. Each step they took churned up dust, a reminder of the unforgiving land that would either reward them with fortune or swallow their hopes whole. Families sold everything they owned for a chance to strike it rich. Fathers kissed their children goodbye, their eyes filled with both fear and promise, while mothers clung to the belief that prosperity might finally lift them from the grip of struggle. The first glint of gold in the muddy waters of Bathurst ignited a frenzy that would ripple across the globe. Ships from distant lands arrived packed to the brim, their decks crowded with adventurers, dreamers, and those fleeing poverty or persecution. They came from China, America, Ireland, Germany, and beyond, their languages mingling in the bustling camps that sprang up overnight. The land, vast and stoic, became a meeting place of cultures, a melting pot of ambition and resilience. On the goldfields, life was as harsh as it was exhilarating. The mornings began with the sharp clang of tools against rock, a relentless rhythm of hope pounding against the earth. Men toiled under the unrelenting sun, sweat streaking their dirt-covered faces, while women labored just as hard, tending to camps, raising children, and nursing the wounded. The nights, illuminated by the flicker of campfires, were filled with tales of fortunes found and lost. Each nugget of gold pulled from the earth felt like a miracle, shimmering in the hands of those who dared to dream. But not all that glittered was kind. The promise of wealth brought with it tension, competition, and the shadow of greed. Disputes over claims often erupted into violence, the desperation for gold turning friends into foes. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, bonds were forged. Neighbors shared scarce supplies, strangers united in song, and communities rallied together against the harshness of the wild. The goldfields were a cauldron of change, and as the years wore on, the impact of this glittering resource began to ripple far beyond the camps. Towns that had once been little more than quiet outposts blossomed into thriving cities. Melbourne and Ballarat rose like phoenixes from the dust, their streets teeming with merchants, builders, and those eager to supply the endless demand for tools, food, and shelter. Banks, post offices, and schools emerged, each brick laid a testament to the transformative power of gold. The railways came next, their iron tracks cutting across the landscape like veins carrying the lifeblood of progress. Trains thundered through valleys and over rivers, connecting towns and bringing goods to markets with a speed that once seemed impossible. Where there had been silence, there was now the hum of industry, the clang of metal, and the roar of opportunity. The gold rush didn't just shape the land, it reshaped its people. Immigrants brought with them traditions, cuisines, and stories that wove themselves into the fabric of the nation. The Chinese miners, with their meticulous methods and resilience, left an indelible mark on the fields and beyond. Festivals filled the air with music, laughter, and the vibrant colors of many cultures blending into one. But with this diversity came friction, as prejudice and fear occasionally reared their heads, casting shadows over the progress being made. Still, the undeniable spirit of perseverance shone brighter than any nugget pulled from the earth. The hardships of the goldfields forged a collective identity, one that valued grit, ingenuity, and the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The rush for gold became more than just a quest for wealth, it was a story of transformation, of people carving out lives against all odds, and of a nation beginning to find its footing in a rapidly changing world. Through the roar of the goldfields and the rise of cities, one truth remained clear: the land held a power far greater than anyone had anticipated. It demanded respect and resilience, rewarding only those who understood its harsh beauty. And as the dust settled and the fever subsided, the echoes of those tumultuous years lingered in the air, a reminder that fortune isn't just found in the earth, it's found in the courage to seek it. On January 1st, 1901, the sun rose on a land that had always been divided, its people scattered across distant colonies, each with its own rules, its own way of life. But that morning, something remarkable was unfolding. It wasn't just another dawn, it was the dawn of something new. A dream, years in the making, was about to become reality. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the land itself knew that the moment had come. For the first time, the colonies that stretched from the eastern shores of New South Wales to the distant sands of Western Australia, from the lush forests of Tasmania to the sunburnt outback of Queensland, would unite. They would form a nation, a Commonwealth, standing together as one, proud and unbreakable. But this wasn't a decision made lightly. It wasn't just a matter of political will, it was a decision born from the struggles, the triumphs, and the quiet hopes of the people who lived across these vast lands. For years, there had been whispers, conversations in smoke-filled rooms, and long debates in the halls of power. Should they remain separate, isolated like a scattered constellation? Or could they become something greater, something whole? The road had been long, and the challenges had been many. Differences between colonies had run deep, each with its own system of government, laws, and priorities. The idea of joining forces had seemed like a distant dream for many, but there were those who knew that the time had come. Some had felt the weight of isolation too sharply, the growing pains of an emerging nation that was too divided to thrive. Others, standing on the precipice of the future, saw the strength in unity, in forging a common destiny. And so, after years of debate, discussion, and negotiation, the moment arrived. On that fateful day, the Australian Constitution was not just a document, it was a promise. It was the blueprint for a new nation, where each colony, each state, would stand equal. It was a document that captured the hopes of every person who had ever called this land home. The drafting of the Constitution had not been easy. There were fierce arguments over what should be included, who should hold power, and what kind of future Australia should aspire to. Would it be a land of freedom, equality, and opportunity? Would it honor the heritage of its Indigenous peoples? What kind of government would steer this new nation forward? Behind the words on the page, there were men and women who poured their hearts into this work, understanding the weight of their actions. They were not just drafting laws, they were carving out the identity of a nation, shaping a future that would affect generations to come. Each line of the Constitution was filled with both hope and responsibility, a testament to the sacrifices made to bring this moment into being. As the first official flag was raised and the words "the Commonwealth of Australia" rang out across the land, it was clear that something monumental had changed. The colonies, which had once been separate and distant, were now bound together by a common purpose, their destinies forever intertwined. The new nation stood at a crossroads. What would it be? A land of opportunity or one shackled by its past? The echoes of history whispered through the streets, and the people, farmers, miners, teachers, and tradespeople, looked to the future with both trepidation and excitement. The laws that had governed their lives were now to be shaped by a new force, a government that represented them all, that promised to protect their rights, their land, and their freedom. The early days of the Commonwealth were marked by a deep sense of hope and optimism. People from every corner of the country, from the vast bush to the bustling cities, gathered together with a shared vision. Australia wasn't just a place, it was an idea, an ideal that they all believed in. In the cities, the streets hummed with energy, and new industries began to sprout up like flowers after a long drought. The outback, once seen as a harsh, unforgiving wilderness, now held promise for those who dared to carve out new lives there. But even as the young nation took its first steps, challenges remained. The question of how to treat the land's first people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, remained unresolved. Would they be a part of this new Australia, or would they remain on the fringes, forgotten? There were promises made, but they were still just that, promises. The scars of the past, the broken promises, hung heavy in the air, and for many, the dream of a truly united nation remained just out of reach. The early national policies began to take shape. The new government, a delicate balance between state and federal powers, worked to create laws that would govern the country. The first steps toward nationhood were marked by debates over tariffs, immigration, and how best to manage the country's vast natural resources. There was excitement, yes, but there was also uncertainty. The world had changed, and Australia's place in it was still being defined. As the country took shape, so too did its identity. It wasn't just a collection of colonies anymore, it was a Commonwealth. But what did that really mean? What did it mean to be Australian? It was a question that would take decades to fully answer, and the answer would be shaped by every person who lived in this land. It would be shaped by their dreams, their struggles, and the way they came together to build something greater than themselves. For now, though, the people of Australia stood united. The world watched as a new nation was born, and as they looked forward to what the future would bring, they couldn't help but feel the weight of history and the power of their collective hopes. In that moment, they knew that they were not just writing a new chapter, they were writing an entirely new book. It was the year 1901, and Australia was celebrating its newfound unity. A nation had been born, a land of promise, of opportunity for its people. But as the celebrations continued, a darker and more complex side of its identity was taking shape. It wasn't immediately clear to the world, nor to its citizens, that the ideals of unity and equality would be reserved for some and denied to others. Behind closed doors, a policy was being drafted, one that would come to define Australia's immigration laws for decades to come. The White Australia policy. Its origins were rooted in a fear of what would happen if the country opened its doors to the non-European world. The policy sought to ensure that only those of European descent could immigrate to Australia, excluding anyone from Asia, the Pacific Islands, and other regions. It was a belief that Australia was meant to be a land for white people, a place where the culture, the identity, and the future were to be shaped by people who looked the same, who spoke the same language, and who shared the same history. In the years that followed, the policy would become entrenched in the fabric of Australian law. Its impact felt far beyond the government buildings where it had been written. It would shape the lives of generations, drawing an invisible line between those who belonged and those who did not. For many, the impact was immediate and harsh. Imagine, for a moment, a family who had spent months, even years, traveling across oceans, hoping to find a better life in Australia. They arrived full of hope, only to be told that they didn't belong, that the land they had dreamed of was not open to them. Their skin, their language, their traditions, everything about them was different. And yet, they stood at the gates, desperate to be let in, hoping that their dreams would be enough to overcome the unspoken rules of exclusion. This was the reality for countless immigrants who were turned away at the docks or forced to endure humiliating tests meant to prove their worthiness. They faced barriers that seemed insurmountable, the weight of their dreams crushed beneath a policy that viewed them as less than human, less than equal. They were told that the land they had chosen was not theirs to claim, that their presence was unwelcome. For many, the rejection was a wound that would never fully heal. The policy's effects were felt most acutely by people of Asian and Pacific Islander descent. The Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian immigrants who had come to Australia seeking work, seeking a better life, found themselves fighting not just for their livelihoods, but for their right to exist in the land they had helped to build. The government, under the banner of the White Australia policy, began to impose strict quotas, setting limits on how many people of non-European origin could enter. It wasn't just about jobs or resources, it was about an identity, about keeping Australia pure. And the people who were left to suffer in the wake of this policy were the ones who had always been left at the margins. Then there were the Pacific Islanders, known as Kanakas, who had been brought to Australia in the 19th century to work in the sugar plantations of Queensland. They had labored under harsh conditions, their lives shaped by the same economic forces that had built the nation. But as soon as their work was done, they were deemed unwanted, their presence in Australia seen as a stain on the country's imagined purity. The White Australia policy called for their removal, sending families away, forcibly deporting men and women who had known no other home. To be told you didn't belong in the land where you had worked, raised families, and built lives was a betrayal that cut deep. For those who had been born in Australia, whose families had lived in the country for generations, the policy was a stark reminder that their identity was forever tied to a legacy of exclusion. They grew up in a land that told them, every day, that their ancestors' sacrifices did not matter, that they were not truly Australian. The legacy of the policy haunted them like a shadow, shaping their lives and the way others saw them. To be Australian meant to be white, and for everyone else, there was no place. But as the years passed, the policy that had once seemed unshakable began to show cracks. The world was changing. The world wars had exposed the flaws in the thinking that had led to such exclusion, and the winds of change began to blow through the Australian political landscape. As the 20th century progressed, a slow but inevitable dismantling of the White Australia policy began. It wasn't easy. It wasn't fast. But bit by bit, year by year, the doors that had once been slammed shut began to creak open, allowing for the first signs of a new, more inclusive vision of Australia to emerge. The shift began with the recognition that Australia could no longer remain an isolated island, both physically and politically. The global world was changing, and Australia had to change with it. By the mid-20th century, the policy that had defined Australia's immigration laws for so long was being quietly dismantled. It wasn't a revolution, it was more of a quiet, determined shift in the mindset of the nation. People began to realize that the dream of a country for all could not be realized through exclusion. The new Australia would need to be a place that welcomed everyone, regardless of their background or skin color. The shame of the White Australia policy could not be erased, but with each step toward dismantling it, a new story was being written, one where all people had a place, where their worth was not determined by the color of their skin, but by their humanity. The scars left by the policy are still felt today. The legacy of exclusion, the deep-seated wounds that were inflicted on families and communities, can't be erased. But in the stories of resilience, and the lives of those who fought for their place in Australia, there is hope. There is strength. And there is the reminder that the path to justice is long, but it is one that can be walked, step by step, together. The cold wind whipped through the trenches, carrying with it the scent of blood and smoke. Soldiers, young and old, lay side by side, their faces grim and their eyes empty of hope. The roar of cannon fire echoed in the distance, mingling with the cries of men who were too far from home to ever return. In the haze of battle, amid the horror of Gallipoli, Australia's fate was forever altered. It was 1915, and young men from all across the country were far from the lands they loved, in a foreign world they could hardly comprehend. The call to arms had been answered by many, eager to fight for the empire, for a sense of purpose, for a cause they could barely explain. But as the blood stained the shores of Gallipoli, as families lost sons and wives lost husbands, the cost of that answer became clear. The Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, would leave a legacy that would haunt the nation's soul forever. The landing at Gallipoli was supposed to be a victory, a show of strength, but what followed was a nightmare that no one could have predicted. The beach, once a place of beauty, was now a killing field, a place where hope came to die. As the soldiers advanced, they were met with walls of gunfire, a relentless onslaught that would leave more than 8,000 Australian men dead. Those who survived would carry the scars, not just on their bodies, but in their hearts. The survivors who made it back to the trenches, those who felt the cold grip of death, who lost their brothers in arms, were never the same. In the aftermath of Gallipoli, the whole of Australia seemed to hold its breath. The young men who had left the country with such hope were now returning as broken spirits, their eyes empty and hollow. The families waited in quiet agony, hoping against hope that their sons would return, but many did not. The war had stolen more than just lives, it had stolen the innocence of a nation. As the years passed, the stories of those who fought, of those who never came back, began to shape a new kind of identity for Australia. The Anzac legend was born not in victory, but in sacrifice. It was a tale of endurance in the face of overwhelming odds, of courage that didn't fade in the face of defeat. The Anzac spirit would become a cornerstone of the nation, a symbol of the strength and resilience of the Australian people. But the toll of the war went far beyond the loss of life. The country, forever changed by the horrors of the battlefields, was left to pick up the pieces. The economy, which had once flourished, now struggled under the weight of the war's costs. Money was scarce, and industries that had once boomed were now silenced. Men who had fought in the war returned to find that the world they once knew had vanished, leaving them with nothing but memories and dreams that could never be realized. And then, there were the widows, the women who had waited for their husbands to come home, only to learn that they never would. They had sent their men off with tears and prayers, and now they returned to empty homes. The country was filled with widows, and with them, a sense of loss that was impossible to measure. The families that had been torn apart by the war now had to learn how to survive without the men who had been their pillars. In the years following the war, Australia found itself in a moment of reckoning. The Anzac spirit lived on, yes, but it was tempered by a harsh reality. The cost of the war, the loss of life, the economic collapse, these were not things that could be ignored. The survivors, those who had fought and bled for a cause they had believed in, now faced a world that didn't seem to have a place for them. For those who returned, it wasn't just the visible wounds that needed healing. The invisible scars, the ones that no one could see, ran deep. The nightmares that came in the quiet of the night, the sounds of gunfire echoing in the mind, the faces of fallen comrades haunting the soul. The men who had fought for a country they loved now found themselves cast aside. There were no heroes' welcomes for them, no grand celebrations. The government, struggling to rebuild the nation, had little to offer those who had given so much. The country itself seemed to change in ways that no one had anticipated. In the wake of the war, Australia became more introspective, more aware of its place in the world. The cost of the war had made it clear that the nation was no longer just a part of the British Empire, it was something more. The Anzacs, the survivors and the fallen, had helped to forge an identity that was uniquely Australian. They had seen the horrors of the world, and they had returned, carrying with them a sense of resilience that would serve the country in the years to come. The economic hardship that followed the war left scars, too. Australia had fought for a place on the world stage, but now it was struggling to keep its footing. Families went without, children grew up with less, and the dream of prosperity seemed to slip further away. Yet, amid the rubble of that broken dream, there was a quiet determination. The spirit of the Anzacs had been forged in the flames of battle, and now it was needed to rebuild the country. The men who returned from the war were determined to carry that spirit with them as they faced the challenges of a new world. But for all the pain, there was also a deep, unspoken bond. The families that had lost so much now clung to the memories of those who had given everything. The Anzac Day services, the commemorations, became a sacred ritual, a moment to honor those who had fallen and those who had returned. The sacrifices of the war were not forgotten, and the legacy of the Anzacs lived on, passed down through generations. In the years to come, Australia would emerge from the shadows of the war, scarred but stronger, its identity forever shaped by the men and women who had given everything in the trenches of Gallipoli. And though the wounds would never fully heal, the spirit of those who fought would continue to burn brightly, a flame that would never be extinguished. The air was thick with tension, and the horizon glowed with a deep, ominous red as the world teetered on the edge of a new kind of darkness. It was 1942. And on the other side of the Pacific, a storm was brewing. The Japanese Imperial Army had swept across much of Asia, and now, the unthinkable had come. The Pacific was on fire, and Australia stood at the brink. The bombs had fallen in Pearl Harbor, and the chilling realization spread across the island: Australia was no longer safe. The defense of the homeland had begun, and this time, it would be different. This time, the world would feel the weight of a nation ready to defend its soil. In the face of such a threat, the country banded together, resolute in its determination to fight. Soldiers, both young and old, left the farms and factories, some never to return. The fear was palpable, but so too was the strength of the Australian spirit, hardened through decades of hardship and sacrifice. There was no question of what needed to be done. The country rallied, the call to arms echoing from every corner of the land. The threat was real, and the enemy was closing in, but the people of Australia refused to let their home fall into enemy hands. In the early days, the air raids were terrifying, the fear of the unknown creeping into the hearts of even the bravest. It was one thing to hear of faraway battles, but now it was real. Australia was no longer just a spectator in the world's conflict, it was a battleground. But as the darkness of war enveloped the island, the light of alliances began to shine. The United States, now in the fight, stood side by side with Australia, and their relationship would become a lifeline. Together, they faced the enemy across the vast Pacific Ocean. The men and women of Australia fought not just for survival, but for the hope of a future they could not yet fully imagine. The soldiers sent to distant shores, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and beyond, fought with a fierce determination born from knowing that their families and homes were at stake. The pain of separation, the fear of never returning, was real. In the thick jungles of New Guinea, the battle was not just against an enemy, it was against the land itself. The terrain was unforgiving, the conditions brutal, and the enemy relentless. But Australian soldiers, hardened by the Great War and shaped by their own sense of duty, pressed on. They fought not only for themselves, but for their children, for their future. The war came at a tremendous cost. Men were lost, and families were shattered. The toll of the Pacific campaigns, the battles that raged in distant lands, was not something that could be quantified by numbers alone. The sacrifice of those who went off to war, leaving behind wives and children, was a wound that would never fully heal. Yet amid the terror, there were stories of resilience. Soldiers, far from home, finding moments of humanity in the madness, sharing a laugh, a memory, a photograph of home. These small things kept them going. It was the promise of return, of peace, that kept them alive. For many, though, that promise would never come. Back on the home front, the fabric of Australian society shifted in ways that would leave a permanent mark. The war effort required everything: their men, their women, their resources. Women, many of them never before seen in factories or at work in fields, now found themselves in roles that were once considered outside their reach. They filled the gaps left by the soldiers, manufacturing ammunition, working in hospitals, and supporting the war machine. The strength of these women, their resolve, their courage, was a pillar that held the country together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. As the war dragged on, hope began to grow. The Japanese were being pushed back, and the tide of battle turned. There was no celebration yet, no victory parade, but the sense of survival, of defiance, began to take root. With every inch of ground reclaimed, the thought of peace grew closer. The war, though, was far from over, and the Australian people could not yet breathe easy. The Allied forces pressed on, together, united in their resolve to defeat the forces that sought to dominate the Pacific. And then, it came. The war ended, and the world that Australia had known was no longer the same. The cost of the war was immense: lives lost, families torn apart, economies shattered, but there was a glimmer of hope. Australia, a country that had fought so hard to defend itself, was now standing on the cusp of a new chapter. It would not be an easy path. The wounds of the war were deep, and the scars would remain for generations. Yet the promise of a new day, of rebuilding, of hope, was there. The post-war era saw a rapid transformation in Australia. What had once been a country built on agriculture and industry now began to evolve into something new. The war had driven technological advances and innovations that would reshape the country. Industry boomed as factories churned out goods, and the workforce, once shaped by necessity, now had a different role to play. The country's economy surged as production ramped up, and the foundations for modern Australia were laid. The population swelled, too. The end of the war saw waves of immigrants arriving from all over the world. Europe, in ruins, sent men and women looking for a new life. They came in search of hope, of opportunity, and many found it on the sunburnt shores of Australia. The cultural landscape shifted, bringing new faces, new ideas, and a new energy to the country. The Australia that had gone into the war was a different one from the Australia that emerged from it. The old world, broken by conflict, was gone. A new, modern Australia was taking shape, its people forever changed by the darkness of war and the light of peace. Australia's role in the post-war world would also change. No longer just a distant outpost of the British Empire, the country had found its place in the global order. Its alliances had shifted, and it now stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States, a key partner in the rebuilding of the Pacific. The sacrifices made during the war had earned Australia a seat at the table, a voice in the international community. And though the shadows of war lingered, Australia had emerged stronger, more determined, and more united than ever before. The war had changed everything, but in the end, it was Australia that had survived, and would rebuild anew. The sun had barely risen when the quiet was shattered. The dust of the outback swirled in the air, and the faint cry of a child pierced the stillness. A woman, desperate and wide-eyed, clutched her child to her chest, trying to shield him from the men who had come to take him. They were government officers, following orders that had been handed down, not from the land, but from a government that saw no value in this child's life other than as a tool for assimilation. This was not an isolated event. This was the story of thousands of children, torn away from their families, their culture, and their homes. They became part of what history would later call the stolen generations, a generation denied its identity, its history, its soul. The children were taken in the name of progress. Their parents, powerless and broken, watched in horror as their children were driven away to institutions, often never to return. The policy was cruel, justified by a belief that Aboriginal culture was inferior, that it must be replaced, erased, and forgotten. These children were taught to speak a language they didn't understand, forced into schools where they were made to forget their heritage. Their connection to the land, to their ancestors, was severed. For generations, this was the reality. And the damage was deep, reaching beyond the immediate loss, touching every part of their being, their sense of belonging, their very identity. The stolen generations were not just a policy, they were a scar that would never heal. The wounds left on the parents were even more unbearable. The land, the sacred land of their ancestors, was not just land to them. It was their history, their spirit, their connection to the divine. To see it all taken away, along with their children, left a sense of grief that no words could capture. It was the kind of grief that runs through the generations, passed down like a bitter inheritance. And yet, despite this, the strength of the Aboriginal people never wavered. They endured, even when they were told they did not matter. They held on, even when everything was stripped from them. But hope, like a whisper in the wind, began to grow. In 1967, after decades of silence, the people of Australia were given the chance to change. The referendum was a moment of reckoning, an opportunity to finally recognize the Aboriginal people as equal citizens in the eyes of the law. It was a small change on paper, but its significance was monumental. The nation, for the first time, was willing to acknowledge that the First Peoples had rights, that they were part of the fabric of Australia. The vote passed overwhelmingly, and with it came a glimmer of hope. But hope, like a seed in the desert, took time to grow. The referendum had given the Aboriginal people legal recognition, but it didn't undo the trauma, the years of dispossession, or the deep wounds of a history that could never be forgotten. Still, it was a step forward. For the first time, there was a flicker of recognition, a signal that the long path of injustice might, at least, be ending. But the fight for rights was far from over. The next chapters would be written in the dust, on the very land that had been taken from them. The land that had fed them for thousands of years, that had been their home, their heart, was still out of their reach. In the 1970s, a movement began to rise. It wasn't just a fight for recognition anymore, it was a fight for what had been lost: land, culture, dignity. The land rights movement, led by the voices of those who had endured so much, began to gain strength. The elders spoke with authority, their words a bridge between the past and the future, a connection to their ancestors that could not be severed. The time had come to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Then, in 1992, a ruling came that changed everything: the Mabwa decision. The High Court of Australia overturned the doctrine of terra nullius, the legal fiction that had denied the Aboriginal people's connection to the land. For years, it had been argued that the land was empty when the British arrived. That was the lie that had justified taking it. But in a landmark decision, the court recognized the truth: the land was not empty. It had been cared for, lived on, and loved for millennia by the First Nations peoples. It was theirs. The Mabwa decision was a watershed moment, a victory that felt like a turning tide. For the first time, the legal system had acknowledged what Aboriginal Australians had always known, that the land was theirs, and that their connection to it was unbreakable. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about justice, about dignity, and about the truth finally being told. But even as the law changed, the scars of the past could not simply be erased. The stolen children, now adults, carried with them the pain of a lost childhood, of years spent in institutions where they were not allowed to be themselves. The elders who fought for their land and their culture, often facing hostility from those who did not understand, continued to speak with a quiet but unrelenting power. They fought not only for themselves but for future generations, so that their children would never have to experience what they had. The fight for land, for rights, for justice, has been long and painful. But in the shadows of this struggle, there has always been a light. The light of a culture that refused to be silenced, the light of a people who have never given up hope, even in the darkest of times. It's in the songs they sing, the stories they tell, and the land that they walk. Every step they take is a reminder of the past and a promise for the future. The struggle is far from over. The path is still long, but with each victory, no matter how small, the first peoples of Australia are reclaiming what was taken from them. They are reclaiming their identity, their heritage, and their land. And with every step forward, they are not just fighting for themselves, they are fighting for the truth, for recognition, for the dignity that has long been denied to them. And though the wounds of history may never fully heal, the fight for justice continues, as fierce and as unyielding as the people who have carried it for so long. The noise was deafening. The whir of machines filled the air, the clatter of hammers and the hum of engines creating a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of a nation awakening. In the distance, smoke rose from factories, and the smell of fresh paint and sweat hung thick in the air. It was the post-war world, a world that had been shattered, rebuilt, and transformed. For many, it felt like the beginning of something new, something big, and something full of promise. But beneath the surface of this industrial boom, there were lives, real lives, that would be forever changed. Across the oceans, from distant lands ravaged by war, the call for a new life was heard. Ships, filled with people seeking a fresh start, began to arrive on Australian shores. They came with little more than their dreams, a handful of belongings, and the hope that they could build a better future. The migration programs were born out of necessity but quickly became the very force that would reshape the social fabric of Australia. With every new arrival, there was a new story. Each person carried a past that they hoped to leave behind and a future they hoped to build. The streets, once dominated by the faces of a few, now began to glow with the diversity of a nation reborn. At first, it was difficult. The language barriers, the unfamiliar customs, and the overwhelming need to make a living in a foreign land made life tough for the new arrivals. But they persevered. Some worked in the factories, others in homes or on farms, but they all contributed to the growth of a nation hungry for progress. And slowly, over time, the barriers began to fall. Families from Italy, Greece, and Lebanon, refugees from Europe, and later, people from Asia and the Pacific, they all began to find their place. Australia, once a land of singular identity, became a mosaic of cultures, each piece adding its own color to the bigger picture. But this was not just a migration of people. It was a migration of ideas, of ways of life, of perspectives. And as these waves of immigrants began to settle, they began to blend their traditions with those of the native Australians. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh pasta and baklava mingled with the earthy scent of lamb and damper. In the streets, the sounds of different languages mixed with the English of the settlers, creating a symphony of voices. It was a transformation that could not be ignored. Slowly but surely, Australia was becoming a place where difference was celebrated, where new traditions could be embraced, and where the idea of being Australian could be anything you wanted it to be. As the migration brought diversity, the cities themselves began to change. Once small, scattered settlements turned into sprawling metropolises. The heart of these cities pulsed with new energy. There was hope, there was excitement, and above all, there was work. The factories and industries were the engines that powered the nation. Men and women alike worked long hours, pouring their sweat into the machines that would build the infrastructure of the future. Roads were paved, bridges were built, and skyscrapers rose from the ground like the dreams of a nation. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. The cities, once quiet and isolated, became vibrant hubs of activity, where people from all walks of life came together to create something bigger than themselves. But even as the cities grew, the countryside was not left behind. The agricultural industry, once the lifeblood of Australia, expanded and evolved. Machinery began to replace manual labor, transforming farms into massive, efficient enterprises. The land was tamed and made productive in ways that had never been seen before. The rural economy flourished, and the people who had worked the land for generations were slowly being replaced by technology and new methods of farming. It was a time of great progress, but also of great loss for some. The old ways were slipping away, replaced by the demands of modernity. In the midst of all this growth and change, society itself was going through its own transformation. The norms that had governed daily life for so long were beginning to break down. The roles of men and women, once rigid and defined, were being questioned. Women, who had spent so long in the shadows of their male counterparts, were starting to step forward. They worked alongside men in factories and offices. They became teachers, doctors, and politicians. It wasn't easy. There were many who resisted these changes, who clung to the old ways. But for those who saw the potential for something different, the winds of change were exhilarating. Women began to carve out a place for themselves in the workforce, in the home, and in society at large. And with this shift in gender roles came a shift in expectations. The traditional family dynamic, once the cornerstone of Australian society, was changing. The roles of the husband and wife, the mother and father, began to blur. Women were no longer just homemakers, they were leaders, they were workers, they were equals. And in this shift, something powerful was born. But the changes were not all rosy. As the cities grew and the economy boomed, there were those who were left behind. The promises of progress didn't always reach the farthest corners of society. The working-class families, who had labored for so long, found themselves struggling to keep up. They were the ones who worked in the factories, who labored in the fields, and who made the cities run. But the promise of a better life was often just that, a promise. Many found themselves still struggling to make ends meet, to find a place in a world that was changing so fast. Yet, despite the struggles, there was something undeniable about the time. It was a time when the impossible began to feel possible. It was a time when hope was tangible, and the future felt like a dream within reach. The new Australians, those who had come to these shores to start over, had found something here. They had found a place to call home, a place where their dreams could take root. The old ways, the old expectations, were being rewritten, not by force, but by the simple fact of life itself. The world was changing, and Australia was changing with it. The economy and the society had been transformed, yes. But so had the people. The faces of Australia were no longer just the faces of the original settlers, they were the faces of all those who had come in search of a better life. And in this change, something beautiful had emerged, a country where every voice could be heard, where every person could dream, and where, despite the hardships, the future was full of possibility. The distant rumble of thunder shook the earth, but it wasn't from the skies above. It came from the hearts of men and women, thousands of miles apart, their fates intertwined in a fierce struggle that would echo across the world. The Cold War was not just a conflict between two superpowers, it was a fight for control, for influence, for the very future of the world. Australia stood in the shadows, not always at the forefront but undeniably a player, caught between two giants, its allegiance uncertain but its place on the global stage undeniable. The war was silent, fought in secret rooms, whispered words in corridors, and yet its impact on the world was deafening. Australia, in its own quiet way, had become a pawn, and sometimes a knight, in a game where the stakes were life and death. In the midst of the Cold War, Australia found itself having to choose sides, forced into the fold of Western democracy or the threat of the Red Empire's creeping hand. Australia wasn't just a bystander, it was a participant in a struggle that spread like a stain across the globe. The Vietnam War, a war that tore families apart, shattered minds, and left scars that would never fade, pulled Australia into the fray. Young Australian men, eager to serve their country, were sent to a land they had never heard of, to fight in a war they didn't understand. The sound of helicopters was the soundtrack to their lives, the rustle of leaves the only sign of danger in a jumble that seemed to swallow everything whole. They were far from home, but the weight of the war was felt in every corner of Australia. Letters home spoke of the terror, the confusion, and the frustration. Young men came home, but not the same as when they had left. The war had taken more than their bodies, it had taken their innocence, their ideals. And for many, the wounds of Vietnam would never heal, their hearts and minds forever changed by a war they didn't want to fight but had no choice but to face. Yet, while some Australians fought in far-off lands, the world back home was changing too. The tension of the Cold War left its mark on Australian politics, and the shadow of the United States loomed large. The country wrestled with its identity, torn between loyalty to its allies and the growing sense of independence. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Australia was beginning to realize that it wasn't just a pawn on the world's chessboard, it was a nation in its own right, with its own role to play in the greater theater of global politics. By the time the 1970s came around, the winds of change were blowing fiercely through Australia's political landscape. The economic policies that had once seemed so secure were suddenly outdated. The world was changing, and Australia was being swept along in the currents of a globalizing economy. The industries that had built the country were beginning to shift. The great manufacturing plants that had once filled the skyline of cities like Melbourne and Sydney now stood as empty shells, relics of a bygone era. The new world was an interconnected one, a world of trade, of borders that were no longer lines on a map but links in a chain of global commerce. For Australia, this new world was both a challenge and an opportunity. The shift in global economics meant Australia could no longer rely on the ties that had once bound it to Britain and the United States. The country began to look east, turning its gaze toward its neighbors in the Asia-Pacific region. There was an understanding that if Australia was to thrive in this new world, it needed to find its place within this growing economic sphere. It needed to build bridges, not just with the old powers, but with the emerging ones. The scars of war, the tension of the Cold War, and the constant pressure to modernize had left their mark on Australia. But in the aftermath of it all, something incredible was happening. Australia began to forge relationships with its neighbors that would transform the region. The once distant nations of Asia and the Pacific, long seen as foreign and strange, now became critical allies, partners in trade, and friends in peace. Australia's role in the Asia-Pacific region began to shift. It wasn't just a part of the Western world anymore. It was carving out its place as a bridge between East and West, a middle ground that could connect cultures, economies, and ideas. The Vietnam War had shown Australia the pain of intervention, and the Cold War had shown it the cost of isolation. But in the years that followed, Australia found strength not in distance but in connection, and a willingness to open itself up to new partnerships and to engage with the world beyond its shores. The post-war world had not been kind to Australia, but it had made the country stronger, more determined to find its own voice on the world stage. With every challenge, it learned more about itself and its place in the world. The once shaky relationship with the United States evolved into a bond that was both protective and beneficial, but Australia knew that it could not survive as a passive player in global politics. Its future, and its success, depended on its ability to navigate the complex world of trade, diplomacy, and relationships with the nations around it. It was a time of upheaval and uncertainty, but also of hope. The New World was no longer a world dominated by just two superpowers. It was a world where Australia could carve out its future, based not on military might or Cold War alliances, but on its ability to adapt, to learn, and to connect. The economic policies that had once been rooted in protectionism and isolationism were replaced by a vision of a globalized Australia, one that saw itself not as a distant outpost of Europe, but as a central player in the dynamic Asia-Pacific region. Through the dust of war, through the struggles of a changing economy, and through the heartache of separation, Australia had come to realize its true strength. It was not defined by the battles it fought or the alliances it kept, but by the relationships it built, the opportunities it seized, and the future it chose to embrace. In a world that was growing smaller every day, Australia had found its place, at the crossroads of East and West, a country poised to thrive in the ever-changing landscape of the 20th century. The earth trembled, not from war, but from a force no one had prepared for, the pounding, unrelenting sound of machines that seemed to swallow the land itself. The air was thick with smoke, the rivers, once clear and clean, now dark with the remnants of industry. It was the early days of Australia's transformation, where the clanging of factories became the heartbeat of a new, prosperous nation. The landscape changed, slowly at first, then with frightening speed, as men and women built, tore down, and reshaped the land. But amidst the progress, something was lost. In the rush for advancement, the quiet beauty of nature was drowned out. Where once the forest stretched endlessly, their towering trees reaching for the sky, now there were bare patches of earth, scars that told stories of land that had been stripped for gain. The rivers, which once shimmered under the sun, were tainted with the debris of human ambition. In the heart of this new Australia, people began to look around and wonder, had they sacrificed too much? The trees they had felled, the rivers they had poisoned, the animals whose songs were now silent. What had they lost in the name of progress? It wasn't just the land that seemed to mourn, it was the people too. Families who once lived in harmony with the land, working together to harvest what it could offer, now stood on the edges, unsure of what they were supposed to protect. The beauty of the earth was fading, and with it, something deeper, something connected to the very soul of the country. What had once been the heart of Australia, its vast wilderness, its thriving ecosystems, seemed to be slipping away. The wild places that so many had taken for granted were now in danger, and the people who had loved them felt a desperate need to fight back, but they didn't know how. The 20th century brought a new kind of challenge, one that Australia could not ignore. The effects of industrialization were becoming too obvious to deny. Pollution filled the skies, the once pristine beaches and forests were now under threat. The country's booming industries seemed unstoppable, but the cost was becoming painfully clear. Wildlife populations began to dwindle, ecosystems that had survived for millennia were now crumbling under the weight of human activity. It was a moment of reckoning. Families who had lived by the land, farmers whose ancestors had worked the soil for generations, began to question the path they were on. Was it too late to save what had been lost? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, like the thick smog that had begun to settle over the cities. In the shadow of factories and smelting plants, people began to look at the world around them with new eyes. They saw the rivers, but they saw them as sickly, tainted. They saw the forests, but they saw them as empty, quiet. The loss was real, and it cut deeper than anyone had anticipated. Debates about climate change began to emerge, each side pushing harder than the last. Some insisted that the Earth's wounds were self-inflicted, and the only way forward was to take responsibility, to change course. Others argued that progress, no matter the cost, was a force too great to be contained. The tension between these voices echoed through the streets, spilling into the halls of government and into living rooms. People, ordinary citizens, fought to have their voices heard. The world around them was changing, and they didn't want to be a part of its destruction. They wanted a future where the air was clean, where the rivers ran clear again, and where the land could heal. But the fight wasn't easy. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The pressures of a rapidly industrializing world seemed to push harder, louder. The noise of progress, of growth, drowned out the quiet whispers of conservation. Still, some persisted. As the decades wore on, the stories of environmental loss grew more urgent, and so did the voices calling for change. A new wave of activism emerged, led by those who refused to give up on the land, the animals, and the future. They fought for conservation, for policies that would protect the environment and stop the relentless march of destruction. They planted trees, they fought to protect national parks, and they campaigned for laws that would limit pollution and preserve the land for future generations. But these efforts were met with resistance. Progress, it seemed, was a stubborn force, unwilling to be slowed. The debate raged on, louder than ever. Could Australia find a way to balance growth with preservation? Could the country move forward while respecting the land that had given it so much? Through the chaos and noise, something began to change. The stories of nature, of loss and healing, began to seep into the hearts of the people. More and more Australians began to see the need to protect what was left, to give back to the land that had sustained them for so long. They began to realize that the earth was not something to be taken, but something to be cared for, something to be loved. And the cries for conservation began to echo louder, more forcefully. In the midst of this struggle, Australia began to take bold steps forward. Environmental policies were enacted that prioritized sustainability. Conservation efforts saw the birth of national parks that would protect vast stretches of wilderness, and laws were passed to limit industrial pollution. The land that had been ravaged began to show signs of healing, its wounds slowly closing as people took responsibility for the damage that had been done. Australia had begun to recognize that its future wasn't just about industry, about economic growth, it was about balance, about living in harmony with the earth. Slowly, but surely, the country began to find its way back to the land that had given it life. The debates on climate change, once divisive and bitter, became more about finding common ground, about protecting what was left. The efforts of environmental activists, of those who had fought for the land, had not been in vain. It was a long and painful journey, but it had sparked something in the heart of the nation, a recognition that without the land, the country could not survive. And as the years went by, more Australians became part of the solution, working together to restore what had been lost. They planted trees. They cleaned the rivers. They fought for the rights of the animals whose homes had been destroyed. They had learned that the earth was not a resource to be exploited, but a partner to be cherished. The echoes of the past, the warnings of those who had fought for change, could still be heard, but they were no longer just warnings. They were a call to action, and Australia was answering. It began with a single voice, a quiet whisper that seemed to echo from the past. It was the voice of a people who had been silenced for far too long, the voice of a nation's heart that had been broken and neglected. The words weren't new, but they carried a weight that shook the foundations of everything Australia thought it knew about itself. "We want our voices to be heard," they said, simple yet powerful. It was a call that carried generations of pain and hope, a call for something more, something real. The past had been a long and brutal story for the Aboriginal people. Generations had suffered under the weight of policies and attitudes that tried to erase their very existence, to push them into the margins of society. Their history was dismissed, their culture disregarded, and their land stolen. But through the dark years, there was something unbreakable within them, something that refused to disappear. The stories of their ancestors, the songs of their past, the knowledge of the land, it was all still there, passed down through the generations, waiting for the day when it could rise again. And then came the turning point. The 21st century began to stir with the winds of change, slowly at first, and then all at once. The whispers turned into conversations, the conversations into movements. People started to listen, really listen. They began to realize that the time had come, that the wrongs of the past could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore, it was about making things right. But how? How could you repair something that had been broken for so long? How could you give back what had been lost? The answer didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, like a puzzle that was too complex to be solved in a single moment. But every piece was important. The apology, the recognition, the willingness to see the world through the eyes of the First Nations people, all of these were part of the healing process. Slowly, the walls that had stood for so long started to crumble. Reconciliation was no longer just a dream, it was becoming a reality, one step at a time. But perhaps the most powerful moment came in 2017, when the Uluru Statement from the Heart was released. The words rang out across the country: "We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country." It wasn't a demand for revenge, but a call for respect, for recognition. It was a plea for the people who had been here for tens of thousands of years to finally be seen, not as a footnote in history, but as the heart of Australia. The Uluru Statement wasn't just a statement of rights, it was a statement of hope, of unity, of an entire people's deep longing to be acknowledged. The weight of those words hung heavy in the air, but they were not without hope. For the first time in decades, there was a sense that real change could come. It wasn't enough to simply say sorry. It wasn't enough to throw money at the issue and hope it would go away. What was needed was respect. What was needed was a partnership, a relationship between Australia's Indigenous peoples and the rest of the nation that was founded on mutual understanding and shared values. The Uluru Statement called for a voice to Parliament, a constitutional body that would allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a say in the laws and policies that affected them. It was a bold request, a demand for inclusion, for recognition of their sovereignty and rights as the original custodians of the land. It wasn't just about a seat at the table, it was about creating a new table, one where the voices of the First Nations people could be heard clearly and with power. But there was more to it than just politics. There was a deeper shift happening, a cultural revival that could no longer be ignored. Indigenous voices, once silenced or marginalized, were now rising to the forefront. They were reclaiming their stories, their culture, their place in the world. Artists, musicians, writers, and leaders were stepping forward, using their talents to share their truths with the rest of the nation. They were telling their stories in ways that no one could ignore, in ways that demanded attention. Through music, through art, through literature, the stories of the Aboriginal people were being brought back to life. The songs that had been passed down through generations were now being sung louder than ever. The paintings that told the stories of the dreaming were being displayed in galleries, celebrated for their beauty and significance. The stories of loss, of survival, and of hope were now woven into the fabric of Australian culture, a tapestry of voices that could no longer be erased. The change wasn't easy, and it wasn't without struggle. There were those who resisted, who clung to old prejudices, who refused to accept that the past needed to be acknowledged. But for every voice of resistance, there were countless others calling for change, for unity, for healing. The path was not without obstacles, but it was a path that was being walked with determination, with love, and with a deep belief that the future could be better than the past. Reconciliation was never going to be quick or easy. It was never going to be a simple matter of saying sorry and moving on. But it was real, it was happening, and it was changing the very soul of the nation. It wasn't just about policies or laws, it was about people, about their stories, about their rights. And as those stories were shared, as those voices were heard, something began to shift in the hearts of all Australians. The recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty wasn't just a political issue, it was a matter of justice, of righting the wrongs that had been done for centuries. Slowly, but surely, the people of Australia began to see each other for who they really were. They saw the deep connection to the land that the First Nations people had always had, the knowledge, the wisdom, and the strength that had allowed them to survive for so long. They saw the resilience, the beauty, and the love that had been hidden in the shadows for too long. And as the sun set over the red earth of Uluru, there was a quiet understanding, an understanding that the future would be different, that reconciliation wasn't just about fixing the past, but about building something stronger, something better, together. The journey was far from over, but the first steps had been taken, and the light of hope was beginning to shine through the darkness. The sun was setting on a quiet, golden horizon, casting long shadows across the Australian landscape. Beneath the calm surface of this vast land, however, was a force quietly building, a force that would soon ripple across the globe, leaving its mark in ways no one could have predicted. Australia, a nation once considered distant and isolated, was on the brink of something much larger, much more interconnected. As the world changed, so did Australia. No longer just a land of sunburned plains and rugged coastlines, it was now becoming a player in the larger drama of global politics, science, and culture. A voice among giants. It was a country with a heart full of promise and potential, yet struggling with its place in the complex web of international relationships. Australia's contributions to global politics were slowly carving out a new role for the nation. In a world increasingly defined by alliances, conflict, and shifting power dynamics, Australia stood firmly by the side of its key allies, supporting their efforts, advocating for peace, and contributing to global stability. With its vast natural resources, strategic location, and the ability to bring unique perspectives to the table, Australia had the tools to influence change. It was a partner to the United States in key military and political alliances, lending its strength to international peacekeeping efforts and the promotion of democratic values. But the world wasn't just changing in political ways, it was evolving on the global stage in science and culture as well. Australia's scientists and researchers had long been making contributions that quietly shifted the boundaries of human knowledge. From groundbreaking medical discoveries to environmental research that helped understand the delicate balance of the world's ecosystems, Australia's work in science had far-reaching consequences. The Great Barrier Reef, the mysteries of the outback, and the study of its native wildlife brought Australia to the forefront of global ecological research. Australia also left an imprint in the world of arts and culture. Its films, music, and literature began to captivate audiences far beyond its shores. Actors like Kate Blanchett and Hugh Jackman became household names worldwide. Musicians like Nick Cave and Sia created sounds that echoed across continents. Writers like Tim Winton and Richard Flanagan shared stories that captured the hearts of readers from different cultures. With every song, every film, every book, Australia was telling its story to the world, not just as a place, but as a living, breathing entity with a voice. But these global contributions didn't come without their challenges. The shifting dynamics of international politics presented new struggles for Australia, particularly as its relationship with two superpowers, the United States and China, grew increasingly complex. Australia's close relationship with the U.S. had long been a cornerstone of its foreign policy. The alliance was built on shared values, common interests, and military cooperation, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. But as the global balance of power shifted, Australia found itself walking a delicate line between its loyalty to the U.S. and its growing economic ties with China. China, with its rapidly expanding economy, was becoming an important trading partner for Australia. The Australian economy, heavily reliant on its exports of natural resources, found a lucrative market in China's massive demand for coal, iron ore, and other minerals. Trade ties deepened, and Australian businesses flourished in the shadow of China's rise. But as the two nations grew closer economically, the political and ideological differences became harder to ignore. Australia, in many ways, was caught between two worlds. Its alliances with the U.S. came with expectations, sometimes pressures, to take strong stances on issues like regional security and human rights. Its growing relationship with China, while economically important, sometimes clashed with the values Australia held dear. The situation became increasingly complex, as Australia had to balance its support for democracy and human rights with the undeniable economic benefits that came with its ties to China. It was a tension that seemed to echo across the world. As superpowers vied for influence, smaller nations like Australia found themselves struggling to maintain a sense of identity, a sense of purpose. It wasn't just about choosing sides, it was about finding a way to stand tall in the midst of a rapidly changing world, to assert one's place without losing one's soul. And yet, through it all, Australia remained resilient. It stood firm in its support for the rule of law and human rights, despite the challenges posed by its relationship with China. It worked tirelessly to foster peaceful relations within its own region, standing up for the Pacific Islands and the nations of Southeast Asia. Australia's commitment to diplomacy, to forging relationships based on mutual respect and shared goals, continued to define its place in the world. As the 21st century unfolded, the challenges of a globalized world loomed larger. Issues like climate change, global health, and the refugee crisis transcended borders and required collective action. Australia, with its unique geography and resources, found itself at the forefront of some of these pressing global concerns. Its scientists were leading the charge in climate change research, and its efforts to provide aid to those suffering from natural disasters were making a tangible difference. Australia's commitment to humanitarian causes, whether it was sending aid to Pacific Island nations threatened by rising sea levels or providing assistance to conflict-ravaged countries in the Middle East, illustrated its growing role as a responsible global citizen. Yet, despite these contributions, Australia faced its own set of challenges in this new world. The rapid pace of globalization, with its interconnected economies and cultures, often brought feelings of alienation and uncertainty. The nation struggled with its identity, its place in a world where borders were becoming less relevant and where the definitions of community and belonging were constantly shifting. The old narratives of isolation, of being far away from the world's great centers of power, no longer applied. Australia was no longer just a far-off island, it was a nation intricately woven into the fabric of global politics, culture, and economics. But as its influence grew, so did its responsibilities. Australia had to learn how to navigate the complexities of a world that was changing faster than ever before. It had to reconcile its values with the realities of a globalized economy, where trade relationships often conflicted with human rights, where diplomacy required sacrifices, and where power dynamics were constantly shifting. But through all the noise, there was something unmistakable. Australia's heartbeat, strong and steady, continued to pulse at the center of it all. It was a nation that had long known how to survive, but now it was learning how to thrive. It wasn't just a land of beauty and contradiction anymore, it was a nation that was finding its voice on the world stage, shaping its future with courage, determination, and a deep understanding that in a rapidly changing world, the most important thing is to never lose sight of who you are. The warm sun spread its golden glow across the streets of a bustling Australian city, casting shadows that danced between towering skyscrapers and leafy parks. Among the sea of faces, each one unique, there was a quiet sense of belonging. It wasn't the kind of unity that demanded sameness, but one that celebrated differences, weaving them into a rich tapestry of shared humanity. Yet, beneath the surface, questions lingered. What did it mean to truly belong in a land so diverse? How could this sense of unity endure in a world constantly shifting? The echoes of Australia's past lingered in the air, whispering lessons to those willing to listen. The mistakes and triumphs of history stood as a guide, reminders of battles fought for justice, for equality, for identity. From the struggles of Indigenous peoples to the resilience of migrants who arrived with nothing but hope, every chapter carried its weight. The story of this nation was far from simple. It was a tale of heartbreak and healing, of division and reconciliation, of dreams nurtured in the soil of perseverance. The challenges of modern governance loomed large over this vibrant nation. A country so vast, so diverse, required leadership that understood its complexities. In the halls of power, decisions were being made that would ripple across generations. Balancing the needs of rural and urban communities, managing the economy in an era of globalization, and addressing pressing issues like climate change were just some of the hurdles Australia faced. Each challenge seemed to pull at the seams of unity, testing the resolve of a country determined to move forward together. The question of social cohesion sat at the heart of these challenges. It wasn't just about politics or policies, it was about the connections between people. The warmth of neighbors helping each other through floods, the joy of festivals celebrating cultures from every corner of the world, the shared grief of national tragedies. All of these moments defined what it meant to be Australian. But alongside these stories of togetherness were moments of tension, of misunderstanding, of fear. The fabric of unity was strong, but it needed care to remain intact. Visions of Australia's future shimmered like a horizon just out of reach. What kind of nation would it become? There were dreams of a society that didn't just tolerate differences but cherished them. A country where Indigenous voices weren't just heard but led the way, shaping the future with wisdom grounded in ancient traditions. A place where innovation thrived, not at the cost of the environment, but in harmony with it, a beacon of sustainability for the world to follow. For every dream, there was also a shadow of doubt. The rapid pace of technological change was reshaping the world, and Australia was no exception. The rise of artificial intelligence, the challenges of cybersecurity, and the shifting nature of work raised questions about how to ensure that progress didn't leave anyone behind. The delicate balance between preserving traditions and embracing the future became a tightrope walk, with each step requiring careful thought and courage. But courage was something Australians knew well. It was etched into their history, from the bravery of soldiers on foreign battlefields to the quiet resilience of families rebuilding after devastating bushfires. It was found in the voices of activists who refused to back down, in the hands of farmers who worked tirelessly under an unrelenting sun, and in the dreams of children who dared to believe in a better tomorrow. The future of Australia wasn't just a question of politics or economics, it was a question of identity. Who were Australians, and what did they want to stand for in the world? It was a question that demanded reflection, honesty, and hope. It called for a nation willing to learn from its past, to face its challenges head-on, and to dream big. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. In the distance, the sound of laughter echoed, children playing, families gathering, friends reconnecting after long days. It was a sound full of promise, a reminder that the heart of a nation wasn't in its laws or its landmarks, but in its people. People who were different yet connected. People who shared a land full of possibility. People who believed, even in the face of uncertainty, that together they could create a future worth living for.